Hey everyone, this is Libertarian Black Man. I just want to put the growth of our economy into the appropriate perspective because when I hear people on CNBC and Bloomberg, Fox Business, and other financial news channels say that our economy is growing very well, it's maddening because in fact our economy has never grown slower over a long period of time than today. And we can look at comparing our economy to China's, for example, which grew at 6.6% back in 2018. That's seen as the lowest pace in 28 years, but we would give anything to have that kind of growth rate because our growth rate last year was only 2.9%, less than half that of China's. When China grows at 6%, that's considered slow. But if we were to grow at 2.9%, which is what we did, then that's considered pretty good. In fact, it is terrible if you look not only at comparing us to China, but comparing us to ourselves. All you have to do is look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, where we get our GDP growth numbers from, and you'll see how we have been slowing down for many years. So, going to the website, you'll see where it says gross domestic product and percent change from preceding period. The column to look at is the column on the right, where I'm going to show you in a second. GDP in billions of change, 2012 dollars. This is the column that shows you what the actual GDP was. GDP in billions of current dollars, this is not the right column to look at because these numbers change every single year because the value of the current dollar changes every single year. So I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about. If we look at the 2010s, we're going to see something that we've never seen before. This is the column to look at. These are fixed numbers. And throughout every single year of the decade so far, of which there's only 1 year left, we do not see a single year in which we grew at even 3%. We came close a couple times last year and in 2015. But this is the first decade in American history in which we have not seen a single year of growing at 3%. Let's look at the 2000s and how we grew during that decade. That was a pretty slow decade too, but for a different reason. Actually, we started pretty strong, 4% in the year 2000. And then we had a couple 3% years in the middle part of the decade. The reason that the decade only averaged about 1.8% growth per year was because of these two negative years, 2008 and 9, of which we had a recession that really dropped economic growth. If you put them together, we have a pretty low a pretty strong drop-off of economic growth in 2009. If you go back to the 1990s, this is the last decade in which we were averaging more than 3% growth per year. As you can see, we had multiple 4% years. 1, 2, 3. We had a 3% year, 4, and another 3% year. So during half the decade's years, we had growth that was over 3%. Back in the 1980s, again, we were averaging 3% a year in GDP growth. And we actually saw a year in 1984 where we were growing at over 7%. Now, this is the kind of growth rate we maintained during the Industrial Revolution for several decades. During this decade, we also had multiple years in which we were growing above 3%. Not just this year, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 years in which we were actually, if you add them up, it's 7 years out of the decade in which we were growing at 3% per year or more. If we look at the 1970s, once again, we were averaging 3% growth per year. And you have multiple years during the decade in which we had that. 3.3% in 71, two 5%, actually 4 5% years. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we had two 3% years and a 4% year. And of course, stagflation comes in the mid-70s. That's a different story. But overall, we did pretty well during the 1970s compared to today. The 1960s was a far better decade than those three put together because we were averaging more than 4% growth per year for the decade. And if you look, this is the only decade in American history, although I think it will be joined by the current decade, but it's the only decade in which we did not have a negative year. And here we have, again, multiple years where we're growing above 6%. A 6% year, 4%, 5%, 6%, 6%, 4%, 3%. The 1950s, another very successful decade in which we were growing more than 4% per year. And this is something we haven't seen at all yet. The decade was very strong, 8%, 2 8% years back to back. And then you have 2 4% years back to back, and a 7% year. We had two recessions, one in 1954, one in 1958. But we had 2 8% years, 2 4% years, a 7%, and a 6% year. Now, during the 1920s and 40s, we were growing even more. GDP growth averaged 6% per year. People like to say World War II was the reason why the economy grew fast during the 1940s, but if that's true, why did it grow so fast during the 1920s also? And that is because the economy was able to create jobs and fill those jobs very easily. And so we maximized productivity. But the most productive period in our history was between 1879 and 1913, where GDP growth averaged 7% per year, and that is after inflation, because we had no inflation back then. We were a much different economy, much less regulated, much less taxed, and we kept our money strong, so we did not have inflation as a result. I want people to know there's so much more to this. We have been slowing down for a very long time, and I explain why in the title of my book, Say No to Big Government, My Case for Maximum Freedom. I just detail that the government, and in particular federal, state, and local governments across the country, have been eating away at economic growth through more taxation, more regulation, and more spending as a result. As long as we continue to go down this road of getting bigger and bigger government, we're going to see slower and slower growth throughout our economy. Those who want to pretend like we have a very fast economy today at 2.9% should be told we haven't seen 3% since 2005. 13 years straight without a single 3% year. That is unprecedented. And until we at least hit 3%, we will never, ever get to see the days in which America grew fast enough to become the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel Libertarian Black Man and follow us on Twitter at Libertarian Black Man, and we hope to see you in the next video.